This year's the 50th anniversary, of course, of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The president today not only lauding it as an American achievement, but trying to get very gritty and detailed and realistic and unromantic about what it cost to do the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The president today praising President Lyndon B. Johnson, talking about how hard it was to get the Civil Rights Act passed and the political cost that he knew he would pay.
He knew that he had a unique capacity. As the most powerful white politician from the South, to not merely challenge the convention that had crushed the dreams of so many, but to ultimately dismantle for good the structures of legal segregation. He's the only guy who could do it. And he knew there'd be a cost. Famously saying, the Democratic Party may have lost the South for a generation.
Between the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Democrats told each other the story that they would lose the South for a generation. Yep. And now, according to Republicans in the South, and nobody's contesting them, it is metaphysically impossible for a Democrat to win statewide office in Mississippi, even as the state reckons with its own culpability for the recent past, even as Mr. Antebellum Ball is a potential Republican nominee for the United States Senate this year. Commemorations like the ones today at the Johnson Library, they are for the heroes, right? They are for the people who were right and who were brave and who we remember as heroes. But the reason we keep living through it again is in part that we forget what it was that the heroes had to be brave about and brave against. It is one thing to tell the story of the people who were right. Part of understanding why it is such a big deal that they were right is remembering who was wrong. We forget to remember who was wrong, not just who was right. Joining us now is Michael Beschloss, NBC News presidential historian. Mr. Beschloss, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Rachel.
Let me ask you about what President Obama said today in this long and complicated and sort of passionate speech. When he talked about the legacy of President Johnson and Democrats' political consequences for supporting civil rights, was he right, and what should we understand about that?
Well, he was right, and what he was quoting Johnson was saying, probably after both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, that the cost of this would be to lose the South to the Democrats. Remember, 1968, the state in the Union that went for John Kennedy by more than any other was Georgia, upwards of 60%. And those were white voters who were voting for Kennedy because they wanted segregation. That's how big a change this was. So the result was that Johnson knew that, yes, the Democrats would lose the South. He said for a generation, it's still going on, as you've said very well tonight. So he was probably over-optimistic. Johnson hoped that the result of the Voting Rights Act would be that you'd enfranchise so many African-American voters that ultimately they would help to overcome that, and the Democrats would be on equal turf in the South, and that hasn't happened yet. How
did LBJ himself react to the aspects of backlash that happened during his political life? When he could see what he had predicted happening, how did he react to it?
He knew it was going to happen, and it happened actually in a much more dramatic way. The Voting Rights Act was passed, as you know, in the summer of 1965. He went down to celebrate at the LBJ Ranch late that summer. That was the time that the riots in Watts occurred. Thousands of rioters, 20 people were dead. The police chief in Los Angeles, William Parker, made this incendiary remark. He said, that's what happens when you give people civil rights and tell them that they've been abused by the law. They develop this kind of disrespect for the law. A lot of people agreed. Even Johnson's old aunt, a woman named Oriole Bailey, who lived on the LBJ Ranch, told LBJ he had gone too far. It went even further. further. In 1966, the Democrats lost 47 seats in the House. It was attributed very directly to white backlash. And the interesting thing is, right after Watts, Johnson, who politically could see around corners, said, one of the people who's going to benefit from this backlash, this conservative movement against not only civil rights but my whole great society, is a candidate in California for governor by the name of Ronald Reagan.
Wow. President Obama speaking at length today about Lyndon Johnson was remarkable, not just because of the anniversary being celebrated and because the president gave such an important speech, but President Obama has not talked very much about President Johnson before. Do you have a theory or any explanation as to why that is?
I can only speculate. You know, he gave his acceptance speech in Denver in 2008 the first time, the day after Lyndon Johnson's 100th birthday. You'd think, you know, speaking to a huge stadium of Democrats, you'd at least mention the guy's name. He didn't. His first year as president, Johnson was not much mentioned, to the consternation of a lot of the Johnson people. I think one reason is that first year, that was the year that President Obama was resisting an awful lot of pressure, largely from the Pentagon, to escalate the Afghanistan war. We do know that he read at least one account, one history book about LBJ making the decisions in 1965 that escalated Vietnam, that ultimately killed the reforms that Johnson wanted to do. So I think at least that first year, Johnson to Obama probably meant Vietnam.
That's fascinating.